The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of the Henderson estate. At 62, Richard Henderson had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. His massive home sat on 5 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, a monument to his success in the technology industry. Richard stood at his bedroom window, coffee in hand, staring at his reflection. The face looking back at him seemed like a stranger's. Tired eyes, worry lines, and a mouth that rarely smiled anymore. Despite his wealth, something felt hollow inside. Mr. Henderson, his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared at the doorway. The contractor for the pool renovation is downstairs. And your financial advisor called again about the investment meeting. Richard nodded without turning. Tell him I'll be down shortly. When Mrs. Chen left, Richard's shoulders sagged. Everyone wanted something from him. His phone buzzed constantly with people seeking his money, his connections, or his influence. But did anyone actually care about him? The man behind the fortune? Later that afternoon, Richard sat through a board meeting for his company. As CEO and majority shareholder, his word was practically law. As executives presented quarterly figures and growth projections, Richard found himself watching their faces instead of the presentation slides. "Excellent work, sir," said Thomas, his chief financial officer, after the meeting. "Your vision for the company continues to exceed expectations." Richard studied Thomas's expression. Was that genuine admiration or just another person telling the boss what he wanted to hear? "Thomas, do you think people would treat me differently if I weren't rich?" Richard asked suddenly. Thomas blinked, caught off guard. Well, that's an interesting philosophical question, sir." "Not philosophical. Practical," Richard replied. "Would you still respect me if I had nothing?" "Of course," Thomas answered quickly. Too quickly. "Your character is what we all admire." But Richard had caught the momentary hesitation. He'd seen it countless times before, people calculating what response would benefit them most. That evening, alone in his study, Richard scrolled through his phone contacts. Hundreds of names. Business associates, charity organizations seeking donations, politicians, celebrities. He paused, wondering which of them would answer his call if his bank account suddenly emptied. His gaze wandered to a framed photograph on his desk. It showed a much younger version of himself standing outside a small apartment building, smiling broadly with his first big check after selling his software company. He'd been happy then, hungry for success but still connected to the real world. An idea began to form in Richard's mind. A crazy idea perhaps, but one he couldn't shake. The next morning, Richard told Mrs. Chen he'd be traveling for a few days on business. Instead of heading to his private jet, however, he drove to a discount store in a part of town he rarely visited. There he purchased several sets of worn-looking clothes, a backpack, and some basic supplies. In the store bathroom, Richard changed into baggy jeans with frayed edges, a faded sweatshirt, and scuffed boots. He messed up his usually perfect hair and didn't shave, letting the gray stubble roughen his appearance. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Richard left his luxury car in a long-term parking garage and took a bus back to his own neighborhood. It felt strange sitting on public transportation for the first time in decades, watching the city roll by through smudged windows. People around him stared at their phones, no one making eye contact. Getting off at a stop near his estate, Richard felt his heart beating faster. He walked slowly along the perimeter of his neighborhood, noticing how people's eyes slid past him as if he were invisible. A woman pulling her child closer as they passed. A man in a business suit crossing to the other side of the street. By mid-afternoon, Richard had positioned himself near the service entrance of his own estate, sitting on a low wall with his backpack beside him. He watched as delivery trucks came and went, as his neighbors drove past in their expensive cars. No one seemed to notice him, or if they did, they quickly looked away. A security guard from the neighborhood patrol approached around 4 o'clock. "Sir, you can't loiter here. This is private property," he said firmly. Richard looked up, recognizing Paul, who had worked security in the neighborhood for at least 5 years. Richard had approved his hiring personally. "I'm just resting," Richard said, intentionally making his voice rougher, not causing any trouble. Paul's hand moved to the radio at his belt. "I'm going to have to ask you to move along or I'll need to call for backup. Could I trouble you for some water first?" "It's been a hot day," Richard asked. The guard's face hardened. There's a public park 3 miles down the road with facilities. I suggest you head there." As Richard gathered his things, a sleek black car pulled up to the service entrance. Richard recognized it instantly. His own personal assistant, Nancy, driving the car Richard had gifted her last Christmas. Nancy stepped out, talking animatedly on her phone. "Absolutely ridiculous demands," she was saying. "But what can you do when the boss is worth billions?" "Just smile and nod, that's my strategy." Richard froze, backpack half slung over his shoulder. Nancy noticed him in the security guard, covering her phone's microphone. "Is there a problem here, Paul?" "Just moving along someone who doesn't belong," Paul answered. "Nothing to worry about." Nancy gave Richard a quick, dismissive glance before returning to her call. "Anyway, as I was saying about the old man's latest project," her words faded as she punched in the gate code and disappeared down the driveway toward Richard's house, where she was clearly comfortable entering. While he was supposedly away, that night, Richard slept in a modest hotel under a false name, paying cash. He lay awake for hours, replaying the day's events in his mind. The way Paul hadn't recognized him, Nancy's casual disrespect behind his back, the invisible wall that seemed to exist between him and everyone else now that he appeared to have nothing. The experiment continued the next day. Richard positioned himself on a bench across from the main entrance to his estate, watching as his business associates, friends, and even family members drove through the gates for what he remembered was a charity planning meeting he'd organized before deciding on this impromptu experiment. A catering van arrived, followed by florists and event staff. Through the ornate iron gates, Richard could see the activity on his own front lawn, a party happening in his home that was now proceeding without him. Around noon, a familiar car pulled up. Richard's heart tightened as he recognized his brother Robert's vehicle. They'd grown up with nothing, supporting each other through tough times, but their relationship had become strained after Richard's success. Robert had never asked for money, maintaining his middle-class lifestyle as a high school teacher, but Richard had always sensed a growing distance between them. Robert stepped out of his modest sedan, then turned back to help his wife Lisa with some covered dishes they'd apparently brought for the gathering. As they walked toward the gate, they passed directly by the bench where Richard sat. For a moment, Richard was certain his brother would recognize him, disguise or not. They shared the same blood, the same childhood memories. Surely the connection between them went deeper than appearance. Robert's eyes briefly met Richard's, then moved on without a flicker of recognition. He punched in the gate code and continued up the driveway with Lisa, disappearing from view. Something broke inside Richard at that moment. If his own brother couldn't see him beneath the shabby clothes, who would? Had money built such a wall around him that his true self had disappeared completely? The afternoon grew hotter. Richard remained on the bench watching the comings and goings at his estate. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since morning, wanting to fully experience what it might be like to be truly needy. A school bus stopped nearby, and several children got off, including a young boy of about 11 or 12. The boy noticed Richard and hesitated, looking at him with open curiosity, rather than the avoidance Richard had grown accustomed to throughout the day. To Richard's surprise, the boy approached, clutching his backpack straps. "Are you okay, mister?" he asked simply. The directness of the question caught Richard off guard. For the first time in his experiment, someone was looking him in the eye, speaking to him like a human being. Richard started, then found himself at a loss for words. Was he okay? The question seemed to cut through all his wealth and status to something more fundamental. The boy stood before Richard, waiting for an answer with innocent patience. Unlike the adults who had passed by all day, there was no judgment in his eyes, just genuine concern. "I'm just a little tired," Richard finally answered. The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "My dad says everyone gets tired sometimes." He dug into his backpack and pulled out a slightly squished sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Do you want half? My grandma always makes them too big anyway." Before Richard could respond, a woman's voice called out, "Alex, what are you doing?" A woman hurried over, her face tight with worry. "Alex, come here right now," she said, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him back. "But Mom, he's hungry," Alex protested. "I've told you not to talk to strangers," she hissed, looking at Richard with undisguised suspicion. To Richard she said, "Please don't approach my son again," before marching Alex away. "I wasn't." Richard began. But they were already gone, the woman whispering furiously to Alex as they walked toward one of the smaller homes at the edge of the wealthy neighborhood. Richard sat back, feeling the sting of the encounter. He had built this neighborhood, had personally approved the architectural plans, had created jobs for hundreds of people in the process, and now he was seen as a threat simply because of how he looked. As the sun began to set, Richard decided to try one more location before ending his experiment for the day. He walked to the front gate of his own estate, where guests were now leaving the charity event. From his position by a tree near the entrance, he could hear snippets of conversation as people passed. Such a shame. Richard couldn't be here, probably off buying another island. His assistant says he's unreachable. A catering van drove out, followed by Richard's nephew Patrick and his wife in their convertible sports car, a car Richard had given them as a wedding present. They were laughing as they passed, not noticing Richard standing just feet away. Uncle Richard would flip if he saw how many of his bottles of champagne we opened, Patrick was saying. What's he going to do, miss the money? His wife replied with a giggle. Besides, he's so busy he probably won't even notice we were there. Richard felt his face grow hot. He had always treated Patrick like a son, mentoring him, including him in family decisions. Yet here he was, taking advantage the moment Richard's back was turned. The stream of departing guests continued until nearly everyone had left. Richard was about to leave himself when he noticed one last person exiting on foot, Mr. Wilson, the old groundskeeper who had worked for Richard for over 15 years. Mr. Wilson moved slowly, his back bent with age, carrying a small container. Unlike the others, he didn't head toward the parking area but instead walked in Richard's direction, apparently heading home on foot. As he approached, Richard lowered his head, not wanting to be recognized, though he realized now that seemed unlikely. To his surprise, Mr. Wilson stopped directly in front of him. "Evening," the old man said. Richard mumbled a response, keeping his face turned away. "Looks like you've had a rough day," Mr. Wilson continued, his voice matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "I've had a few of those myself." Richard looked up cautiously. Mr. Wilson's weathered face showed no sign of recognition, just the calm expression of a man who had seen much in his lifetime. "They had plenty of food left over in there," Mr. Wilson said, holding out the container he was carrying. "Shame to see it go to waste. I was taking some home, but you look like you could use it more than me." Richard stared at the container, then at Mr. Wilson's face. "Why would you help me?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You don't know me," Mr. Wilson shrugged. "Don't need to know you. Just need to know what's right." He placed the container on the ground next to Richard. "There's a shelter about 10 blocks east of here if you need a place to stay tonight. Tell them George sent you." Before Richard could respond, Mr. Wilson continued on his way, walking slowly down the street until he turned a corner and disappeared from view. Richard opened the container to find carefully packed leftovers from his own kitchen, roast chicken, vegetables, and a slice of cake. His chef's cooking, meant for the charity event he should have been hosting. As he ate sitting on the ground outside his own home, Richard felt something shift inside him. The food tasted better than anything he could remember eating recently, perhaps because of his hunger, or perhaps because of the unexpected kindness with which it had been given. That night, Richard checked into the same modest hotel, his mind racing with everything he had witnessed. He barely slept, instead making notes on his phone about each encounter, each revelation. By morning, he knew this experiment needed to continue, but with a new purpose. After another day of wandering through his own city, virtually invisible, Richard found himself back near his estate as evening approached. This time, he positioned himself near the service entrance where the neighborhood's workers, gardeners, housekeepers, delivery people, came and went. He watched as Mr. Wilson arrived for his evening shift, moving slowly but deliberately. The old groundskeeper didn't notice Richard this time, focused on getting to work on time despite his obvious physical discomfort. Richard followed at a distance, watching as Mr. Wilson began tending to the garden beds that lined the long driveway to the main house. The old man moved methodically, stopping occasionally to stretch his back or rub his knees. "Need some help?" Richard asked, approaching cautiously. Mr. Wilson looked up, recognition dawning on his face. "Oh, it's you from yesterday. You still around these parts?" Nowhere else to go, Richard replied, which wasn't exactly a lie. Thought I might repay your kindness. Mr. Wilson studied him for a moment, then nodded toward a rake leaning against a tree. Know how to use one of those? For the next hour, Richard worked alongside the man who had been his employee for 15 years. They spoke little, but Richard learned more about Mr. Wilson in that hour than he had in all the years before. How the old man walked to work because his car had broken down months ago and he couldn't afford to fix it. How he sent most of his paycheck to his daughter, a single mother with 2 children. How despite everything he found peace in tending to the gardens. You're not bad at this, Mr. Wilson said as they finished. The security team doesn't usually bother me, so you're welcome to help out other evenings if you want. Can't pay you, but there's always leftover food from the house. The owner doesn't mind, Richard asked. Mr. Wilson chuckled. Mr. Henderson. He's never around to notice. Always traveling, always busy. Nice enough man, I suppose, but lives in his own world. The words stung, but Richard knew they were true. You've worked here long? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice casual. 15 years, Mr. Wilson replied. Started when this was all just dirt and plans. Mr. Henderson hired me personally back then. Seemed to care more about things in those days. Before Richard could respond, Nancy's voice cut through the evening air. Mr. Wilson, why is this person on the property? You know the rules about outside workers. Richard turned to see his personal assistant marching toward them, her face flushed with anger. He's just helping me, Miss Nancy, Mr. Wilson explained calmly. My back's been giving me trouble. That's not your decision to make, Nancy snapped. Mr. Henderson has strict policies about who is allowed on the grounds. Mr. Henderson isn't here, Mr. Wilson pointed out. And thank goodness for that, Nancy muttered. He'd have a fit if he saw unauthorized people wandering around. She pointed at Richard. You need to leave immediately, or I'm calling security. Richard looked at her. This woman who managed his schedule, who knew all his preferences, who he trusted with personal matters, and she looked right through him. I'll go, Richard said quietly. Mr. Wilson frowned at Nancy. There's no need to be unkind. He wasn't causing any trouble. That's not the point, Nancy insisted. We have protocols. She turned back to Richard. Well, are you leaving or do I need to call Paul? For a moment, Richard was tempted to reveal himself, to see the shock on Nancy's face when she realized who she was speaking to, but something held him back. This experiment wasn't finished yet. There was more to learn, more to understand. Good night. George, Richard said to Mr. Wilson, thank you for your kindness. As he walked away, Richard heard Nancy lecturing the old groundskeeper about security risks and proper procedures. Her voice faded as he reached the road, but her words had left their mark. His own assistant, who he paid generously, who he had always treated with respect, spoke about him with such dismissive contempt. Richard walked for hours that night, through parts of the city he had never seen, despite living there for decades. He passed small family restaurants with their warm lights and laughter spilling onto the sidewalk. He saw couples walking hand in hand, friends gathered on front porches, children playing in community parks even as darkness fell. There was a life happening all around him that he had somehow missed while building his fortune. A world of small kindnesses and genuine connections that money couldn't buy. By the time he returned to his hotel room, Richard had made a decision. His experiment wasn't over. It was just beginning. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Richard's hotel room. For a moment he forgot where he was, reaching for his phone to check the stock market as he did every morning. Then reality settled back in. The experiment, the revelations, the decision he'd made last night. Richard sat up and looked at his reflection in the small bathroom mirror across the room. 3 days without his usual grooming routine had changed him more than he expected. His silver hair stuck out in odd directions, and his beard was coming in patchy and unkempt. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper somehow. He thought about calling his driver, ending this charade, and returning to his normal life. It would be so easy to slip back into the comfort of wealth, to pretend he hadn't seen what. He'd seen or heard what he'd heard, but the memory of Mr. Wilson's simple kindness and Nancy's casual cruelty kept him from reaching for his phone. After a quick shower, Richard put on his worn clothes again and headed out. This time he had a specific destination in mind. He caught a bus heading downtown, sitting quietly among morning commuters who stared at phones or out windows, carefully avoiding eye contact with each other, and especially with him. He got off near the city's financial district, where his company's headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a gleaming skyscraper. For 30 years, Richard had entered through the executive entrance, whisked directly to his private elevator. Today, he stood across the street, watching as his employees streamed into the building. Many faces he recognized. People who worked directly for him, who attended his meetings, who he thought he knew. Yet not one of them glanced his way as they hurried past, lattes in hand, absorbed in their own worlds. Richard spotted Thomas, his chief financial officer, stepping out of a town car. The same Thomas who had assured him that people respected him for his character, not his money. Thomas walked briskly, talking animatedly on his phone. "Of course I can handle things while he's away," Thomas was saying as he passed close to where Richard stood. "Between us, this might be the perfect opportunity to push through those cuts we've been discussing. Henderson's always been too soft on the support staff anyway." Richard felt his stomach clench. Those support staff were people Richard had personally fought to protect during previous budget discussions. People with families and mortgages who kept the company running smoothly. He watched Thomas disappear into the building, then turned away. He'd seen enough. Richard spent the morning wandering through a part of the city he rarely visited, an area where small businesses struggled to survive as rents increased. He noticed a small diner with a "Help Wanted" sign in the window and, acting on impulse, went inside. The owner, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and work-roughened hands, looked him up and down skeptically when he asked about the job. "You got experience waiting tables?" she asked. "No," Richard admitted, "but I'm a quick learner." She seemed about to refuse, then sighed. "Look, I'm desperate. Cook just quit and I'm running this place alone. Can you wash dishes at least?" Richard nodded. "I can do that. Minimum wage cash at the end of the day," she said. "I'm Vicky. Start by cleaning those tables over there." For the next 8 hours, Richard worked harder than he had in decades. He washed mountains of dishes, scrubbed tables, mopped floors, and even learned to work the ancient cash register when Vicky needed help during the lunch rush. His back ached, his hands grew red and chapped, and he discovered muscles he didn't know he had. But something else happened too. Regulars greeted him with nods that grew friendlier as the day went on. A truck driver left him a tip after seeing him run back and forth between the kitchen and dining area. Vicky showed him how to make real coffee, not that fancy stuff, and seemed pleased when he got it right. By closing time, Richard was exhausted, but oddly satisfied. Vicky handed him $80 in cash. "Not bad for a first day," she said. "You coming back tomorrow?" Richard pocketed the money, the first he'd earned by the work of his hands in 30 years. "Yes," he said. "I'll be back." As he left the diner, Richard realized he'd spent the entire day not thinking about his company, his wealth, or his real identity. For 8 hours, he'd just been a dishwasher doing his job, connecting with people who saw him, really saw him, not his bank account. The feeling stayed with him as he walked back toward his hotel. He passed a small neighborhood park where children played on swings while parents sat on benches nearby. A familiar figure caught his eye. Alex, the boy who had offered him his sandwich yesterday, was playing basketball with some friends. Richard sat on a bench, watching the game. When the ball bounced his way, he picked it up and tossed it back. Alex looked at him, recognition dawning on his face. "Hey, it's you," Alex said, jogging over. "Are you feeling better today?" Before Richard could answer, Alex's mother appeared, her expression alarmed when she saw who her son was talking to. "Alex, come here right now," she called. "It's okay, Mom," Alex protested. "He's just watching us play." "Now, Alex," she insisted. Richard stood up, hands raised slightly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just sitting here." To his surprise, Mr. Wilson's voice came from behind him. "He's all right, Diane. He helped me with the garden work yesterday at the Henderson place." Richard turned to see the old groundskeeper standing there in his civilian clothes, a small bag of groceries in his hand. Alex's mother, Diane, looked between them uncertainly. "You know him, Dad?" Richard blinked in surprise. "Dad?" Alex was Mr. Wilson's grandson? "Met him yesterday," Mr. Wilson said. "He's new in town, looking for work. Got a good back for gardening." Diane's expression softened slightly, though suspicion still lingered in her eyes. "Well, Alex needs to come home for dinner now anyway. Can he come too?" Alex asked suddenly, pointing at Richard. "You always say we should help people who are having a hard time. Mr. Wilson looked at Richard thoughtfully, then at his daughter. Got plenty of stew on the stove. Diane hesitated, clearly torn between her instinctive caution and her father's apparent trust in this stranger. Finally, she nodded once, curtly. Dinner's at 6, she said to Richard. Dad can show you where we live. As she called Alex to come along, Mr. Wilson chuckled quietly. Don't mind my daughter, he said to Richard. She's had a tough time since her husband left. Makes her careful around strangers, especially near Alex. I understand, Richard said, genuinely touched by the invitation. Are you sure it's okay if I come? Wouldn't have agreed if it wasn't, Mr. Wilson replied simply. Besides, seems to me like you could use a home-cooked meal. I'm George, by the way. Don't think I properly introduced myself yesterday. Richard, he replied automatically, then froze, realizing he'd given his real name. If George noticed his discomfort, he didn't show it. Well, Richard, hope you like beef stew. Diane makes the best in the city. An hour later, Richard found himself sitting at a small kitchen table in a modest apartment just outside the wealthy neighborhood where his mansion stood. The walls were thin enough that they could hear the neighbor's television, and the furniture was worn but clean. Photos of Alex at various ages covered the refrigerator, along with school artwork and reminder notes. Diane remained reserved, but Alex chattered enough for everyone, telling Richard about school basketball and his dream of becoming a veterinarian someday. Animals don't care if you're rich or poor, Alex explained seriously. They just care if you're kind to them. That's very wise, Richard said, surprised by the lump that formed in his throat. After dinner, as Diane cleared the plates, George led Richard to the small balcony where they could speak privately. So, George said, lighting a pipe, you want to tell me who you really are? Richard stared at him, stunned. What do you mean? George chuckled. Been working for rich folks most of my life. Got a sense for things. Your hands tell me you've never done manual labor before this week. The way you talk tells me you've got education. And the way you look at everything like it's all new tells me you're not really down on your luck. You're looking for something. Richard sighed deeply, feeling a strange relief at being seen so clearly. Would you believe me if I said I'm trying to understand what's real and what isn't in my life? George puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. Sounds like the kind of question a man asks when he's standing at a crossroads. They sat in companionable silence for a while, looking out at the city lights. In the distance, Richard could see the hill where his estate stood, the security lights outlining its perimeter. Whatever you're searching for, George said finally, just remember that folks like us, like Diane and Alex, we don't have the luxury of philosophical questions. We live in the real world where rent comes due and medical bills pile up and grocery prices keep rising. That's our reality. Richard nodded slowly, understanding more clearly than ever before. Thank you for dinner, George, and for the conversation. It means more than you know. As Richard prepared to leave, Alex ran up and pressed something into his hand, a small, smooth stone with a streak of quartz running through it. It's my lucky rock, Alex explained, but I think you need it more than me right now. Richard closed his fingers around the stone, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of a child who had so little yet gave so freely. Walking back to his hotel in the growing darkness, Richard made another decision. Tomorrow would be the final day of his experiment, but it wouldn't be the end. It would be a beginning. Richard woke early on the 4th day of his experiment, Alex's lucky stone still clutched in his hand. He placed it carefully in his pocket as he prepared for what he had decided would be his final day, living as an ordinary man. At the diner, Vicky greeted him with a nod and handed him an apron. Coffee machine's acting up again. Think you can take a look? Richard, who had built a tech empire but had never fixed a coffee machine, spent 30 minutes figuring out the problem was a loose wire. The satisfaction on Vicky's face when the machine sputtered back to life gave him a strange sense of pride. The morning rush kept him busy. A young mother with tired eyes and a fussy baby left without paying her bill, clearly embarrassed as she fumbled with an empty wallet. Richard noticed Vicky watching but saying nothing as the woman hurried out. "You're not going after her?" Richard asked. Vicky shrugged. "Jenny's husband lost his job last month. She's got 3 kids and comes in here twice a week for the only hot meal she probably gets. Some things matter more than money." Richard thought about the countless business meetings where he and his Executives had discussed acceptable loss margins and revenue optimization, clinical terms for decisions that affected real people like Jenny. During his lunch break, Richard called his lawyer using a payphone outside the diner. The lawyer was shocked to hear from him after days of silence, but agreed to set up the paperwork Richard requested, without asking too many questions. Back at the diner, the afternoon shift brought in a group of construction workers, their clothes dusty from a day's labor. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands, recognized Richard from the park the day before. "You're the guy talking to little Alex, right? George's friend?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Ben, Diane's brother." Richard shook his hand, surprised by the connection. "Yes, I had dinner with them last night." Ben studied him for a moment. "Dad mentioned you. Said you seemed like someone trying to find your way back to something important." Before Richard could respond, Ben continued, "Look, we need an extra pair of hands at the site tomorrow. Nothing fancy, just cleanup work. Pays better than dishwashing if you're interested." The offer touched Richard deeply. One working man helping another, no questions asked, no judgments made. "Thank you," Richard said sincerely, "but I won't be able to. I have some important business to take care of tomorrow." Ben nodded, understanding. "Offer stands if things change. George says you're good people, and that's good enough for me." As closing time approached, Richard helped Vicky clean up. She seemed troubled, checking her phone frequently and sighing. "Everything okay?" Richard asked. Vicky hesitated, then shook her head. "Got a letter from the property management company. They're raising the rent again, third time in 2 years. Don't know how much longer I can keep this place going." "Who owns the building?" Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Some big corporation," Vicky said, waving her hand dismissively. "Henderson Holdings or something. Never met the actual owner. Just get letters from their management company." Richard felt his face flush with shame. Henderson Holdings was indeed his company, one of dozens of investment properties he'd acquired over the years. He had never visited this building, never considered the small businesses like Vicky's that were affected by the rent increases his property managers implemented to maximize profits. "Maybe you could talk to them," Richard suggested carefully. "Work out a different arrangement." Vicky laughed bitterly. "People like us don't get to negotiate with people like them. They don't even see us." Her words hit Richard like a physical blow. Wasn't that exactly what his experiment had shown him? How invisible ordinary people were to those with wealth and power. How invisible they had been to him. After receiving his day's pay, Richard walked to George's apartment building. He needed to say goodbye, though the thought filled him with unexpected sadness. Alex answered the door, his face lighting up when he saw Richard. "You came back. Grandpa said you might not." Diane appeared behind her son, her expression softer than the day before. "Come in. Dad's out on the balcony." George was sitting in his usual spot, pipe in hand, gazing out at the city lights. He didn't seem surprised to see Richard. "Figured you'd stop by," he said, gesturing to the other chair. "Last night of your journey, isn't it?" Richard stared at him. "How did you know?" The old man chuckled. "Been watching people all my life. You found whatever it was you were looking for. It's there in your eyes." "I don't know if I found it or lost it," Richard admitted. "Everything I thought was important seems empty now. And everything I never noticed seems to matter more than anything." George nodded slowly. "That's usually how it works. We spend half our lives chasing after the wrong things and the other half trying to find our way back to what really matters." They sat in comfortable silence until Alex called them in for ice cream. The boy had carefully prepared 4 bowls, each with exactly 2 scoops. "I put extra chocolate sauce on yours," Alex told Richard, "because chocolate makes everything better." As they ate, Diane mentioned she was looking for a second job to help pay for Alex's asthma medication. "My health insurance at the school doesn't cover all of it," she explained, "and prices keep going up." "What medication does he need?" Richard asked. "Pulmicort," she replied. "It's almost $300 a month even with insurance." Richard knew the pharmaceutical company that made Pulmicort was one he had invested in heavily last year. The CEO had proudly announced price increases to improve shareholder value. Increases that translated directly into hardship for families like Diane's. After ice cream, Richard said his goodbyes, promising Alex he would keep the lucky stone safe. The boy hugged him tightly, and even Diane smiled warmly as she thanked him for spending time with them. "You're welcome at our table any time," she said, and Richard knew she meant it. On his walk back to the hotel, Richard's mind was made up. He had one more stop to make before ending his experiment. The next morning, Richard shaved his beard, trimmed his hair as best he could, and put on the cleanest of his worn clothes. He took a bus to his estate, but instead of hiding near the gates, he walked directly up to the main entrance and pressed the intercom. "Yes?" came Nancy's voice, crisp and professional. "I need to speak with Nancy," Richard said. "Tell her it's regarding Mr. Henderson." Minutes later, Nancy herself opened the gate, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to shock as she recognized the disheveled man standing before her. "Who are you? How did you get past security?" she demanded. "I think you know who I am, Nancy," Richard said quietly. She stared at him, confusion giving way to horrified recognition. "Mr. Henderson? Is that really you?" "We need to talk," Richard said, walking past her into his own home. "Please gather the household staff in the main living room immediately." 30 minutes later, Richard stood before his assembled staff, the housekeeper, the chef, the gardeners, the security team, and Nancy. Most looked confused. A few looked afraid. Only Mr. Wilson seemed unsurprised, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "For the past 4 days," Richard began, "I've been living as a homeless person in our neighborhood. I've been sitting outside these gates. I've worked as a dishwasher. I've experienced what it's like to be invisible." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room. Nancy's face had gone pale. "I learned some difficult truths during this time," Richard continued, "about how people treat each other, about what really matters, and about myself." He looked directly at Nancy. "I heard how you speak about me when you think I'm not around. I saw how you treated someone you thought was beneath you." Nancy began to stammer an apology, but Richard held up his hand. "I'm not firing you, Nancy, but things are going to change around here. For all of us." He turned to Mr. Wilson. "George, I believe you've known who I was all along." The old man shrugged. "Had my suspicions. Figured you had your reasons." "I did," Richard acknowledged, "and they've led me to make some decisions." Over the next hour, Richard outlined the changes he planned to implement, both in his household and in his business empire. Wages would be raised. Rental properties would have caps on increases. The foundation he'd established years ago but had neglected would be revitalized with new funding for healthcare, education, and housing initiatives. "And one more thing," Richard added, reaching into his pocket for Alex's lucky stone. "I've been reminded that the most valuable things can't be bought. Kindness, honesty, seeing people as they truly are." He placed the stone on the table in front of him. "This was given to me by a child who has very little but shares everything he has. It's the most valuable gift I've received in years." Later that afternoon, Richard drove himself, for the first time in decades, to George and Diane's apartment building. He knocked on their door, no longer dressed in worn clothes but in a simple button-up shirt and slacks. Alex answered, his eyes widening as he recognized Richard despite the transformation. "You look different," the boy said. "I am different," Richard replied. "Thanks in part to you and your grandfather. Is he home? I'd like to speak with both of them." When George emerged from the back room and saw Richard in his true identity, he just nodded as if confirming something he'd known all along. "So," the old groundskeeper said with a small smile, "Richard Henderson himself. Wondered when you'd drop the disguise." "You knew?" Diane asked her father, shocked. "Suspected," George corrected. "A man doesn't develop calluses like mine without years of work." His hands told the real story. Richard smiled. "I have a proposition for both of you." "A new position for you, George. Managing the foundation that will be doing a lot more good in this community. And or you, Diane, if you're interested, a job in our education initiative." Alex looked between the adults, confused but excited by their reactions. Richard knelt down to the boy's eye level. "And for you, I have something too." He held out the lucky stone. "I'm returning this because I don't need luck anymore. I found something better. The truth." Alex took the stone, then surprised Richard by placing it back in his hand and closing his fingers around it. "Keep it," the boy said seriously. "Everybody needs a little luck. Even rich people." Richard felt his eyes grow warm with tears as he pocketed the stone once more. "You're right, Alex, and I'm the luckiest man in the world to have met you and your family." As the sun set over the city, Richard Henderson understood that while his experiment was over, his real journey was just beginning. 6 months had passed since Richard Henderson's life-changing experiment. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, and the trees lining his estate had turned brilliant shades of orange and gold. But the most significant changes had occurred far beyond the landscaping. On this particular morning, Richard sat in what had once been his formal dining room, a space previously used only for business dinners and charity galas. Now the massive oak table was covered with blueprints, grant applications, and community project proposals. The Henderson Foundation had taken over much of the mansion's first floor, transforming unused opulence into working spaces. The youth center renovation is running about 2 weeks behind schedule, George said, pointing to a set of blueprints. In his role as foundation manager, the former groundskeeper had traded his gardening tools for a tablet and reading glasses, though he still refused to wear anything more formal than a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "What's the holdup?" Richard asked, studying the plans. "Permit issues with the city. But Ben thinks his crew can make up the time once they get started." Richard nodded. Ben had proven to be an exceptional construction manager, bringing in projects under budget while creating jobs for people who needed second chances, just as he had once offered Richard. The intercom buzzed, and Mrs. Chen's voice came through. "Mr. Henderson, the diner crew has arrived for the meeting. Send them in." "Please," Richard replied. Moments later, Vicky entered, followed by 3 other small business owners from the same neighborhood. They no longer looked nervous in the mansion, having become regular visitors over the past months. Vicky's diner had become the first success story of Richard's new business approach. Not only had he frozen her rent for 5 years, but he'd also provided funding to renovate the space and update equipment. In return, Vicky had expanded her hours and hired 4 additional staff members, creating a community hub that now offered free meals to families in need every Sunday. "The restaurant incubator program is ready to launch," Vicky announced without preamble. Direct and practical as always, she handed Richard a folder. "We've selected the first 3 candidates, all local cooks with great food but no startup capital." Richard reviewed the proposals while Vicky explained how the program would provide mentorship, equipment, and 6 months of subsidized rent to help new food entrepreneurs get established. "This is exactly what I had in mind," Richard said, genuinely pleased, using our resources to help people help themselves. After the meeting, Richard walked his guests out. As they reached the front door, a yellow school bus pulled up to the gate. The security guard, no longer Paul, who had been reassigned after Richard discovered how he treated people, waved the bus through with a smile. "Looks like Alex's class is here for their tour," Richard observed. Vicky chuckled. "That kid has you wrapped around his finger, doesn't he?" Richard smiled, touching the lucky stone he still carried in his pocket. "He changed my life. The least I can do is show his classmates how vertical farming works." Behind the mansion, what had once been purely decorative gardens had been transformed into an educational space, showcasing sustainable agriculture techniques. 3 large greenhouses used solar power and water recycling systems to grow fresh produce year-round, much of which supplied Vicky's diner and other local restaurants at affordable prices. As the 5th graders piled out of the bus, Richard spotted Alex immediately. The boy had grown at least an inch over the past months, and wore a junior environmental scientist t-shirt, a gift from Richard after. Alex had shown extraordinary interest in the greenhouse. "Project Mr. Henderson," Alex called out, waving enthusiastically. Unlike his classmates who were awed by the mansion and grounds, Alex ran straight to Richard as if visiting an old friend. "Ready to show your friends how the vertical garden works?" Richard asked. "I've been practicing my presentation all week," Alex replied seriously. Richard had arranged for Alex to lead part of the tour, explaining the basics of hydroponics to his classmates. The boy's teacher had reported that his interest in science had flourished since becoming involved with the greenhouse project, and his grades had improved dramatically. As they headed toward the first greenhouse, Richard spotted Diane's car pulling up to the gate. She worked at the foundation offices 3 days a week now, coordinating the education initiatives, but today was usually her day at the school where she still taught part-time. When she stepped out of the car, Richard noticed she wasn't alone. Thomas, Richard's former CFO, was with her. The past 6 months hadn't been smooth for everyone. When Richard had announced the major changes to his company, higher wages, profit sharing with employees, and a redirection of 30% of profits into community investment. Several executives, including Thomas, had strongly objected. Some had left for other companies, but Thomas, after initially threatening to resign, had surprised everyone by asking to be reassigned to work with the foundation instead. "I've spent my career focused on maximizing profits," he had told Richard. "I'd like to spend the rest of it seeing what those profits can actually do when properly invested in people." Now Thomas worked alongside Diane, developing financial literacy programs for schools and families. Their professional relationship had gradually evolved into friendship, and recently, Richard had noticed something more developing between them. "Sorry we're late," Diane said as they approached. "The school board meeting ran over. They've officially approved our pilot program for all 5 district schools." This was significant news. The financial education curriculum they'd developed would now reach thousands of students, teaching basics that most schools overlooked: budgeting, saving, responsible credit use, and investing. "That's wonderful," Richard said. "I knew you could convince them." Thomas smiled, his formerly stern face now more relaxed. "Diane did the convincing. I just provided the intimidating spreadsheets." "Don't sell yourself short," Diane replied. "Your presentation made all the difference." She turned to her son. "Alex, are you ready for your big moment as tour guide?" The boy nodded confidently. Richard watched with pride as Alex gathered his classmates and began explaining how plants could grow without soil, using water, nutrients, and light in carefully controlled environments. "He's got quite a future ahead of him," Thomas observed. "Thanks to you," Diane said to Richard. Richard shook his head. "No, thanks to himself, and to you and George for raising him with the right values. I just provided some resources." As the tour proceeded, Richard found himself reflecting on how much had changed. His relationship with money had transformed. Instead of seeing his wealth as a measure of success, he now viewed it as a tool for creating opportunity, not just for charity, but for empowering people to build their own success stories. Nancy approached, tablet in hand. Though still serving as Richard's assistant, her role had evolved too. The experience of having unknowingly mistreated her boss had humbled her considerably. Now she managed the household with a new respect for every staff member. "Mr. Henderson, the investors from Singapore will be calling in 30 minutes, she reminded him. The investors represented Richard's newest venture, convincing other wealthy individuals to adopt his model of community-integrated business. It hadn't been easy. Many of his former peers thought he'd lost his mind, allowing sentiment to interfere with maximizing returns. But a small group of forward-thinking investors had become intrigued by the unexpected benefits of his approach. Not only had employee turnover at his companies dropped to almost zero, saving millions in training costs, but customer loyalty had skyrocketed as word spread about the ethical changes. The businesses were still profitable, less so in the short term, but with far greater sustainability for the long run. "I'll be there," Richard assured Nancy. "Just want to finish the tour first." As the children excitedly examined trays of lettuce growing under specialized lights, one of the teachers asked Richard, "What made you decide to create all this? You could have just enjoyed your wealth privately." Richard watched Alex carefully explaining the water filtration system to his friends, his small hands gesturing enthusiastically as he spoke about environmental sustainability. "I learned that wealth only matters when it's circulating," Richard replied. "Like water in these systems. If it just sits in one place, nothing grows." After the tour, as the children boarded the bus for their return to school, Alex ran back to Richard. "I almost forgot. I made you something." He pulled a small handmade card from his backpack. On the front was a carefully drawn greenhouse with stick figures of what appeared to be Richard. Alex, Diane, and George standing beside it. Inside, in careful handwriting, it read, "Thank you for being the best teacher. Not about plants, but about seeing people." Richard felt that now familiar warmth in his chest, the feeling that had replaced the hollow emptiness he'd carried for so many years. "Thank you." "Alex," he said sincerely, "I'll put this on my desk." As the bus pulled away, George appeared at Richard's side. "Never would have guessed this is where we'd end up when you were pretending to be homeless and helping me rake leaves," the old man said with a chuckle. "I wasn't pretending to be homeless," Richard corrected gently. "I was pretending to be wealthy for 30 years before that. This, connecting with people, making a difference, This is real. George nodded thoughtfully. You know what I think? I think that lucky stone Alex gave you wasn't really for luck. It was to remind you to stay grounded. Richard laughed. Well, it worked. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, Richard hosted a community dinner in what had once been his private garden. Long tables had been set up outdoors and people from all walks of life mingled together. Foundation staff, small business owners, construction workers, teachers, and families from the neighborhood. Vicky's diner had catered the meal, with help from the first participants in her restaurant incubator program. The food was simple but delicious, and the atmosphere was filled with conversation and laughter. Looking around at the gathering, Richard saw George and Alex setting up a small solar-powered fountain they had built together. Diane and Thomas were deep in conversation with a group of teachers about expanding their financial literacy program. Ben was showing Mrs. Chen photos of his crew's latest renovation project. Nancy was actually laughing at a joke told by one of the kitchen staff. These were no longer his employees, his charity cases, or his projects. They were his community, his friends, his family, in a way his wealthy associates had never been. Richard touched the lucky stone in his pocket and smiled. The experiment that had begun as a wealthy man's whim had ended with him finding something far more valuable than money. He had found his way home.